My name is Solen Rowe. I'm 34 years old. For most of my life, I believed one simple thing. If you work hard enough and love quietly enough, the people who share your blood will eventually see you. I was wrong. I found out how wrong in front of 180 people wearing a black dress I'd had tailored for exactly this night. 2 hours before I walked into that ballroom, an unknown number sent me a text. 6 words. Don't walk in unless you're ready to lose everything. I walked in anyway. I didn't know it yet, but that message wasn't the only one waiting for me, and it wouldn't be the last. Someone close to this family had been trying to warn me for longer than I understood. I just hadn't learned to listen yet. It was June 14th, and Houston was doing what Houston does. In June heat thick enough to wear, pressing against the windows of the Four Seasons like it was trying to get inside too. Town cars idled 3 deep at the valet stand on Lamar Street, headlights blinking red in a slow line, and past the revolving doors, a jazz quartet played something that sounded like Ellington. I didn't walk through those doors. I came in through the side entrance off the service corridor near the loading dock. A brown leather portfolio held tight under my arm, worn at the corners, heavier than it looked. 4 months of work packed inside it. I wasn't trying to make a scene. I was trying to avoid one. My husband Torrin was turning 40 that night, and Row Development had rented the grand ballroom to celebrate. Round tables in ivory linen, a raw bar, his initials piped in gold on a 3-tier cake. He stood at the head table in a charcoal suit, mid-speech thanking his team, while I slipped along the back wall in my black V-neck dress, hair twisted off my neck, trying to find a seat without drawing a single eye. I didn't make it 3 steps. My father, Oberon Crow, saw me first. I watched his face change the way a sky changes right before a storm. He set his scotch down hard enough that the ice rattled, cut straight across the dance floor, through the middle of his son-in-law's speech, and took my elbow like he was removing something spilled from a table. "Solen," he said, loud enough that the tables nearest us went quiet. "You don't belong here tonight. Get out." My father does not raise his voice by accident. Every volume, every word is a decision. He wanted the room to hear him. He pulled me toward the kitchen doors, past the folded linen carts, past a busboy who froze mid-step with a tray of champagne flutes. My mother, Lysandra, stood near the head table in her pearls, wearing the same polite, camera-ready smile she'd worn at every Crow family function since I was a child. Her eyes already deciding I was the problem. My younger sister, Callista, stood beside her in our grandmother's pearl necklace, the one promised to me since I was 16, and I heard her lean toward the woman next to her and murmur just loud enough, "She's making a scene again." I didn't pull my arm away. Some part of me, the part that had spent 34 years hoping this man would finally choose me, still didn't want to fight him in public. I looked him dead in the eye instead, and asked quiet enough for just the 2 of us, "Are you throwing me out of my husband's birthday party?" His jaw tightened. "Don't embarrass this family in front of the governor." 2 hotel security guards started moving toward us. Up on the 2nd floor mezzanine, behind the glass railing overlooking the ballroom floor, my 7-year-old daughter, Brielle, stood gripping the balcony with both hands, watching everything unfold below her like a play she didn't have the script to. They thought I'd come to apologize. They thought, after everything, I was walking back into that ballroom, ready to smooth things over, the way Crow women were raised to do. They had no idea what was in that portfolio under my arm. 4 months of forensic accounting, verified by an independent examiner, sat against my ribs. And the text I'd gotten 2 hours earlier was only the beginning. There were others coming. And by the end of this story, you'll understand that every single one of them had the same source, hiding in plain sight the whole time. Nobody watching that night could have guessed this was about to become the kind of story people talk about for years. Not just gossip, but a reckoning. Just as one of the guards reached out to touch my arm, a chair scraped hard against the marble floor. The kind of sound that cuts through a room like glass breaking. Governor Evander Pike stood up. He buttoned his jacket, the way men do when they intend to be taken seriously, and looked directly at my father. "Do you know who she is?" The room went silent. The kind of silence where you can hear the air conditioning ticking through the vents. My father let go of my arm. "Before I take you back to where all of this started, if you've ever been the one who held a family together while everyone else quietly took you for granted, stay with me. This one's for you." Because to understand why I walked into that ballroom carrying enough evidence to end my own father's empire, you need to understand what he took from me first. Not just that night, but for years before it. 4 months before the gala, I was at my desk on a Tuesday night. The kind of ordinary evening where nothing feels like it's about to change. I was a community development attorney buried in a partnership file between Row Development and the state of Texas, an affordable housing initiative for the 3rd Ward that Torrin had poured 2 years of his life into. That's when I found it. My digital signature. On 3 authorization documents I had never signed. I read the same page 4 times because I thought I was misreading it. I wasn't. Money was moving from Row Development accounts into a cluster of shell companies under something called Crow Legacy Group. My father's company. I drove straight to the house I grew up in, off Fulton Street in Acres Homes. The one with the porch swing that had been creaking since Eisenhower and never once got oiled because Daddy said it earned that sound. I found him in his study and laid the documents on his desk without a word. He looked at them for a long moment. He didn't deny it fully. "That's how this family protects what it's built," he said. "Torrin doesn't understand how this game is played." He offered me a deal, silence, in exchange for officially putting Brielle in the family will, and a seat on the family foundation's board. I said no. And that same week, I told Torrin everything. Looking back, my father's offer wasn't really about the will. It was about control. The same control he'd used my whole life, dressed up as generosity. Underneath the navy suits and the boardroom voice was a man terrified of being seen as anything less than untouchable. And he'd rather buy my silence than risk a daughter proving he wasn't. That fear is what made him double down instead of come clean, even sitting across from the one person who still might have forgiven him if he'd just told the truth first. He didn't explode. That's not who he is. He went quiet for a long moment, then told me something he'd never shared before. 2 years earlier, my father had approached him with a profit-sharing arrangement tied to an old renovation project, terms deliberately vague. Torrin had turned it down flat. Since then, the relationship between the 2 men had been nothing but surface courtesy. "I want to look into this myself," he told me that night, quietly. "Give me some time." I didn't know yet how far that would go. I need to tell you about something that happened 5 years before that conversation, because it's the reason my hands were shaking when I drove home that night. When Torrin was starting Row Development, the bank turned down his first loan application. Not enough credit history behind him. I remember him at our kitchen table, not saying much, just turning his coffee mug in slow circles. I didn't think twice. I sold the only thing I owned outright, a small duplex in the 3rd Ward my aunt had left me. The one piece of security nobody could ever take from me, and put every dollar into my husband's company. My father found out. At a family dinner not long after, in front of half our relatives, he laughed and said loud enough for the whole table, "My daughter threw away the only safety net she had on a man who'll never measure up. I sat there. I didn't defend myself, and I didn't defend Torin. I let it pass over me the way I'd learned to let so many things pass over me in this drama family I was born into, where silence was always safer than the truth. A few days after I sold that duplex, an envelope arrived at my office. No name on it. Inside was a single 2019 bank statement and a handwritten note. The money from your duplex didn't only go to your husband's company. Part of it moved again within 48 hours. I kept that piece of paper for 5 years. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself a lot of things, and I never once asked myself, who would have known that much, that fast, unless they were standing close enough to the family's books to see it happen in real time. 3 years before the gala, I was offered a senior counsel position at a major firm in Dallas, nearly double my salary. My mother called me in tears, begging me to stay in Houston because your father's heart isn't right, and this family needs its oldest daughter close. I turned Dallas down. A year later, at a family party, I heard my father tell his guests that Callista was the one who knew how to build a real career, while I had chosen to stay home and prop up my husband. I heard every word. I didn't correct him. I went home, locked myself in my office, and worked until 2 in the morning, not because the work mattered that night, but because it was the only thing in the house that still felt like it was mine. 2 of the biggest things I ever owned: a piece of property and a future in another city, I gave away for this family. Both times I was handed the same verdict: not enough, not smart enough, not worth defending. 2 weeks before the gala, Callista came to my house with a box of pastries from a bakery on Alameda Road, and a warning wrapped in sisterly concern. "Daddy's really upset," she said, settling onto my couch like she hadn't come with an agenda. "Don't make a scene on your husband's birthday." Then, almost like an afterthought, she mentioned that the scholarship fund named after Brielle, the one my father had announced with so much fanfare, cameras and all, actually had only 12% of the donated money left in it. Right before she walked out my front door, she looked at me and said something so quiet I almost missed it. "The black hard drive in Daddy's old desk drawer? Have you ever seen it?" I didn't answer. I didn't sleep that night. I told Torrin everything Callista had said. Something about it, the hard drive, the scholarship numbers, pushed him past quiet suspicion. 2 days later, he hired a forensic financial investigator of his own to formally trace my father's accounts, the same way I'd already brought in an independent examiner to verify what I'd found. "If there's more," he told me, "I want to know before we walk into that room." Around that same time, I made a decision I hadn't told anyone yet, not even Torrin. I filed a confidential preliminary complaint with the Texas State Auditor's Office, laying out what I'd found in the housing partnership documents. Governor Pike's office had worked with me on a city contract back in 2023, and through that connection, I asked, quietly, formally, whether investigators could be present at the gala without drawing attention. 2 agreed to attend as guests. I decided to bring everything with me that night: the verified files, and the knowledge that if my father wanted a stage, I would use it against him. At 6 o'clock that evening, as I stood in my bedroom putting in my earrings, my phone lit up one more time. "Don't trust the hard drive from your sister completely." I thought I had gathered every piece of evidence I needed. That message told me there was still at least one layer I hadn't uncovered yet, and it would take me the rest of that night to understand exactly who kept trying to reach me, and why they never once signed their name. My father offered me silence in exchange for security, a guaranteed spot in the will, a seat on the board, and peace at every future family dinner. I said no. If that same offer landed in your lap tonight, comfort and peace in exchange for looking away, would you take it, or walk away from it the way I did. Comment Team Peace if you'd take the deal. Comment Team Truth if you'd walk away like I did. No fence sitting tonight. Right after the governor's question landed in that ballroom, nobody moved. My father tried to hold on to his smile. "Governor, this is just a family matter." Evander Pike walked into the middle of the dance floor, his voice gone flat and cold. "Mr. Crow, the moment your foundation filed falsified paperwork with the state, it stopped being a family matter." Two guests near the back of the room rose from their seats. The state financial investigators I'd quietly arranged weeks earlier to be here tonight. Hotel security closing in on me only moments before now took direction from the governor's own detail and stepped back. I opened my portfolio and pulled out the first printed page. An authorization document bearing my digital signature and the road development seal, directing $2.4 million into one of my father's shell companies. My mother tried to redirect the room. "So Len is still upset about old family history." Callista forced a laugh. "She likes to make things bigger than they are." Torrance spoke for the first time all night, his voice low but unmistakably clear. "My wife doesn't need to make anything bigger. The paperwork already speaks for itself." One of the two investigators, a woman I recognized instantly, someone I'd helped 3 years earlier get out of a coercive business contract, leaned close enough that only I could hear her. "We already have the recording from the internal meeting on March 17th, she said. "He didn't just use your signature. He used your niece's name too." In that moment, I understood something about my father I'd spent 34 years refusing to see. His need for control wasn't really about money. It was about never once in his entire life tolerating the feeling of being small. Using my name, and even Brielle's, wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a man so afraid of losing his empire that he stopped being able to tell the difference between his family and his assets. That fear is exactly what made him reach for a 7-year-old's name instead of stopping when he still could have. When my father turned to look at me with that same familiar contempt he'd worn my whole life, something in me went very still. I thought about 4 straight years of staying up late reviewing community contracts for Crow Legacy without ever taking a dollar in payment. He'd put his hand on my shoulder once and said, "You do this for the family, not for money." And here he was tonight, ready to have security drag me out like a stranger. The governor raised one hand. "No one touches the display equipment." My office had shared the verified files with the state's team days earlier in case this exact moment came, and it had. The large screen behind the stage set up for Torrens' birthday tribute video switched instead to the first page of a financial ledger. The room held its breath. A ballroom full of Houston's most powerful people, frozen, mid-drink, mid-bite, mid-conversation, staring at numbers about to unravel a family empire built on borrowed trust. My father's eyes moved from the screen to me, and for the first time in my adult life, I watched something crack behind them. Not guilt exactly, fear. The fear of a man who's spent decades believing his name alone was enough armor. "This is a private financial matter," he said again, quieter this time, like repeating it might make it true. "It stopped being private," the governor said, "the moment state housing funds moved through falsified authorizations." I flipped to the second page, quarterly transfers, time-stamped and dated, moving in patterns too consistent to be accidental. Then, an internal email pulled from company servers in which my father instructed his staff to use Solen's digital signature so it doesn't raise questions. A donor near the front went pale and covered her mouth. My mother's composure, so carefully maintained for decades, began to slip at the edges. She reached for my father's arm, whispering something I couldn't hear, but I saw his shoulders stiffen in response. Brielle, still up on that mezzanine balcony, had both hands wrapped around the railing, watching her grandfather's face change in real time. I hadn't wanted her to see any of this, but some part of me understood that maybe every daughter in this family needed to finally see what had been hiding under the surface. The investigator beside me spoke again. "There's more," she said. "Page 4 is going to be harder to look at than the first 3 combined." I assumed she meant scale. I had prepared myself for financial betrayal. I had not prepared myself for what came next. Before the screen advanced, my father made one more attempt, spreading his hands wide, the posture of a man trying to charm his way out of a burning building. Friends, I think we're overreacting to some kind of misunderstanding between my daughter and myself. Solène has always had a flair for the dramatic. Nobody laughed. The silence in that ballroom was its own verdict. Lysandra's hand tightened on his sleeve. I watched her lean in and murmur something sharp, and for a second, the mask she'd worn my entire life slipped enough for me to see genuine panic underneath it. Callista stood frozen near the edge of the stage, eyes darting between our parents, calculating which direction to run. I looked up at the mezzanine one more time. Brielle hadn't moved. I turned back to the investigator. "Show them page 4, I said. She nodded to her partner, who advanced the display. And the room, which I thought had already reached its breaking point, discovered it hadn't come close. The screen filled one line at a time with the quarterly transfers, then the internal email in full, then 2 images side by side. The glossy donor brochure for the Third Ward project showing finished homes with green lawns and a children's playground, and beside it, a current photograph of the actual site. Bare dirt, a chain-link fence, nothing built at all. A murmur rolled through the crowd like a wave breaking. The ice in someone's abandoned scotch cracked audibly in the quiet. Somewhere behind me, a woman's heel scraped the marble floor as she shifted her weight, unable to stand still. The chandelier light seemed too bright suddenly, the way a hospital hallway feels too bright at 3 in the morning. Every face in that room lit up, whether it wanted to be seen or not. I remember thinking absurdly that the string quartet was still holding their instruments, bows resting on their knees, waiting for someone to tell them whether to keep playing. That's when Callista stepped forward from among the guests, holding something small and black in her hand. Her fingers were shaking around it. I noticed that before I noticed anything else my little sister, who had spent her whole life perfecting the art of never letting her hand shake in public, standing in the middle of the grand ballroom with her knuckles white around a hard drive the size of a deck of cards. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at our mother, like a child checking whether she was about to be punished before she'd even finished the sentence. "I've had this since last year," she said, her voice shaking as she handed it to the investigators. "I was going to use it to negotiate. I don't want to go down with them today." Our mother's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Our father's jaw worked once, twice, like he was chewing on a word he'd decided not to say. The investigators plugged it in, and a recording played through the ballroom's sound system. An internal meeting. My father's voice, unmistakable, instructing his team to clean up the numbers and make sure nobody looks too closely. Then my mother's voice, cutting in just as clearly, coordinating the exact language they'd use with donors if anyone asked questions. My mother's face went pale. I watched Torn's hand curl into a fist against the white tablecloth, slow, deliberate, like he was holding something down inside himself by main force. He didn't look at me. He was staring at the screen, the way a man stares at a car accident he can't stop watching. Then, the 4th page of the ledger loaded onto the screen, a single transfer dated exactly 1 year earlier, Brielle's birthday. The amount matched dollar for dollar the sum I'd received from selling my duplex, plus 5 years of accrued interest. The room let out a collective gasp. Torrin took a full step backward. For the first time since I'd known him, I watched my husband's composure disappear. He put a hand over his mouth, just for a second, the way you do when you've been struck somewhere you didn't know you could still be hurt. My father tried to shift the blame onto Callista and my mother. Lysandra turned on him, her voice sharpening into something I'd never heard from her before. You're the one who decided which projects would fail so you could pull the money out. I didn't decide anything you didn't already sign off on, he snapped back. And for the first time in 34 years, I watched my parents stop performing for an audience and simply fight. No pearls, no composure, no charm. Just two people who had built an entire marriage on managing appearances, doing it badly in public for the first time in their lives. The two of them began accusing each other openly in front of every guest in the room, the whole drama family unraveling in real time in front of the very people my father had spent his career trying to impress. A donor near the front actually turned her back on them physically, the way you'd turn from something indecent. I saw a man I recognized from the Chronicle's business section quietly slide his phone out of his jacket pocket and start typing. In the middle of that shouting match, my father said something he clearly didn't mean to say out loud. If it wasn't for the night she sold that house, I wouldn't have had the capital to keep this thing spinning in the first place. The words landed in the room like a dropped glass. For a second, nobody moved, like the whole ballroom needed a breath to understand what they'd just heard a man say about his own daughter's sacrifice. That single sentence told me more about my father than 34 years of silence ever had. He wasn't confessing out of guilt. He was defending himself the only way he knew how, by proving he'd been clever enough to use even my sacrifice as leverage. Underneath the anger was something almost pitiful. A man who genuinely believed that turning my love into capital was resourcefulness, not betrayal. Because he had never once had to answer for it before. That's what happens when nobody in a room has ever told a person no. The line between family and asset disappears, and he crossed it without even noticing he had. Callista turned to stare at him like she was seeing a stranger. The room went colder than the air conditioning could explain. I stood there for a moment doing nothing at all. Not because I didn't feel it. I felt it in my chest, like a hand closing around something. But because some part of me had been waiting 5 years to hear him admit it out loud, and now that he had, I didn't need to say a single word back. Let the silence do what I'd spent a lifetime doing for him. That's when Brielle's nanny brought her down from the mezzanine. My daughter ran to me and grabbed my hand, and in the small, clear voice that carried further than she probably realized, asked, "Does Grandpa still love me?" The silence that followed was long enough that I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. I knelt down in my black dress on that marble floor, not caring that the hem would need cleaning, not caring that 180 people were watching a mother kneel in front of her child in the wreckage of a birthday party. I held her face in both hands, small, warm, familiar, in the exact way my own mother's hands had never quite felt to me. And I understood, kneeling there, that this was the actual reason I'd carried that portfolio into the ballroom at all. Not to win, not even to be believed, just to make sure that no 7-year-old in this family would ever have to spend 34 years wondering the way I had. "I love you," I told her. "That's never going to change. Not ever." I didn't answer her question about her grandfather. Some truths, even at 7, take longer to hear than others. She nodded the way children do when they've decided to accept an answer, even if it isn't the one they asked for, and she leaned her head against my shoulder. I could feel her heartbeat quick and light through the thin fabric of my dress. Somewhere behind us, I heard my mother's breath catch. Not sympathy, I don't think. Recognition, maybe, of a version of tenderness she'd never once offered any of her own daughters in a room full of witnesses. Before the room could fully absorb what Brielle had just asked, my mother's phone lit up on the table, beside her screen, bright enough that several guests standing behind her could read it without trying. I couldn't see it from where I stood, but I watched my mother's hand freeze over the phone, hovering the way you hover over a stove burner you're not sure is still hot. And I watched the blood drain further from a face that had already gone pale. And I understood that whatever was on that screen was about to change the direction of everything that happened next. A guest near her, a woman I didn't recognize, read it aloud before my mother could stop her, her voice unsteady. It says, "If Solène ever makes a scene, use the scholarship fund in the granddaughter's name as a shield. She'll fold." The room turned as one toward my father. He didn't deny sending it. I looked down at Brielle, still leaning against me, and thought about the 12% Callista had mentioned 2 weeks earlier over a box of pastries, the scholarship fund, with my daughter's name on it, already gutted before tonight even began, already loaded, like a weapon he'd planned to use on me if I ever dared to fight back. He hadn't just been willing to spend her name, he'd planned it in advance. That was the part I don't think I fully understood until I was standing there, holding her. Governor Evander Pike didn't wait for the room to settle. "Effective immediately," he announced, "all state housing assistance connected to Crow Legacy Group is suspended pending full investigation." The words hung in the room the way a verdict hangs in a courtroom. Final, procedural, and somehow louder for how calmly he said them. In the room adjoining the ballroom, Row Development's board convened an emergency session and instructed Torin to freeze every transaction connected to my father's companies. Donors began leaving in clusters, several already on the phone with attorneys before they'd reached the valet stand. I watched a woman in a beaded gown clutch her husband's arm and murmur something about their own foundation's exposure, already thinking 3 steps ahead to whatever this might mean for her own name. I stood very still near the head table for a moment, Brielle's hand still in mine, and let the room empty around us the way water drains from a tub, slowly at first, then all at once. Someone from the catering staff quietly began clearing the abandoned cake, the gold-piped initials still intact, untouched, absurd in its perfect symmetry against everything falling apart around it. I remember thinking that Torin would never get to actually eat a piece of his own birthday cake, and for some reason, that was the detail that almost undid me before anything else did. My father pulled me aside into a corner near the emptied dessert table. His voice dropped low and urgent. Up close, under the unforgiving ballroom light, I could see what the last 20 minutes had cost him. A thin sheen of sweat at his hairline, his collar slightly askew, for the first time all night. A man whose armor had always been his stillness, now visibly unable to keep his hands from moving. "I can amend the will this week. Brielle gets named officially. Just don't let this go to the press." I didn't answer him right away. I only held up my phone and showed him a message, the same one that had just lit up his wife's screen in front of a room full of witnesses, forwarded to me weeks earlier so I'd have it in writing before tonight ever happened. He stared at it, and for the first time all night, had absolutely nothing to say. I watched something in his face go slack, the particular defeat of a man realizing the walls he'd built to protect himself had been photographed from the inside for weeks. I raised my voice loud enough for the people still standing near us to hear clearly. "My daughter deserved to be loved before you ever needed her as a shield." He didn't answer that either. He just looked at me, The way you look at something you dropped and can't figure out how to pick back up. Callista was escorted aside to give a formal statement. By the following week, my mother had been quietly removed from every charitable board she sat on. My father was placed under emergency financial oversight before the month was out. Torn and I gathered Brielle and walked out to the car. No one from the Crow side of the family reached for a goodbye hug. The car door closed, and the engine turned over into the warm Houston night. For a while, nobody spoke. Brielle had fallen asleep almost instantly in her booster seat, worn out the way children get worn out after holding themselves very carefully for too long. Her cheek pressed against the window, a faint fog of breath blooming and fading on the glass. The radio was off. I could hear the tires on the wet asphalt. It must have rained while we were inside, though I hadn't noticed. And somewhere out past Lamar Street, a siren rose and faded, unrelated to us, just the ordinary sound of a city that had no idea what had just happened inside one of its ballrooms. On the drive home to our house in the East End, Torrin took my hand at a red light and said something I hadn't expected. The investigator I hired 2 weeks ago, he found something. I haven't told you all of it yet. I turned to look at him. The dashboard light caught the side of his face, and for a second he looked older than 40. Older than the man who'd been laughing with his team at the head table 3 hours earlier. The light changed to green before he could say more, and he didn't finish it that night. I sat with the weight of it the rest of the way home, watching the streetlights slide past the windshield in long, yellow smears, understanding that even after everything that had just happened, this story wasn't done unfolding. We got Brielle into bed without waking her fully. She murmured something about the cake, half dreaming, and I told her there'd be other cakes, which felt like both a lie and a promise at the same time. Torrin stood in her doorway a long moment after I'd pulled the blanket up, watching her breathe, and I understood he needed that quiet, the same way I did. Proof that at least one person in that house had gotten to the end of the night without carrying any of it. The days that followed moved slower than I expected. Grief has a strange rhythm when the person you're grieving is still alive, still breathing, still walking around somewhere in the same city, just no longer someone you can call family in any way that means anything. I didn't cry the night of the gala. I didn't cry the next morning either, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold, staring at nothing in particular, listening to the porch swing next door creak in a wind I couldn't feel from inside. I went through those first few days on something like autopilot, answering the investigator's follow-up calls in a flat, careful voice, signing statements, driving Brielle to school like it was any other Tuesday, smiling at the crossing guard, forgetting twice why my hands were shaking on the steering wheel, until I remembered all over again. The tears came 4 days later without warning, while I was folding Brielle's laundry and found one of her small socks with the hole worn through the heel, the most ordinary thing in the world. And something about that unremarkable little hole broke something loose in my chest that 34 years of composure had kept locked down tight. I sat down, right there on the laundry room floor, the dryer still warm and humming behind me, and let it come. I let myself cry for exactly as long as it took the load of laundry to finish drying. Then, I wiped my face, folded the last shirt, and went to make dinner. That's the thing nobody tells you about finally standing up for yourself. It doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like grief wearing triumph's clothes. You mourn the family you wished you'd had, even as you're relieved to finally be free of the one you actually had. Betty, my neighbor 2 doors down, stopped me at the mailbox that Thursday and asked if everything was all right. She'd seen the local news segment, the reporter standing outside the Four Seasons with Crow Legacy Group under state investigation, scrolling beneath her. I gave Betty the short version, standing there in my robe with the mail still in my hand, the morning heat already starting to press down, even at that hour. She patted my arm and said, "Well, honey, you did the right thing. Took guts, though. I don't think I could have done that at my own husband's birthday party, of all things." I didn't plan the timing, I told her. The timing just refused to wait for me. Betty laughed at that, a real laugh, and shook her head. Sounds about right. The truth never does pick a convenient night. We both laughed, the exhausted kind of laugh that comes after something too big to process yet, and, for a moment, standing there in the ordinary morning light with a stack of bills in my hand, it almost felt like things might eventually be normal again. That's the strange mercy of ordinary life continuing around you, even after your whole world rearranges itself. The mail still comes. The porch swing still creaks. Betty still wants to know if you're doing all right. 3 months later, my father and mother were formally facing both civil and criminal charges. Callista accepted a plea agreement in exchange for a reduced sentence, agreeing to testify against both of our parents. I opened a small legal practice dedicated to helping Black families exploited in so-called community development projects, the exact kind of fraud my father had built his empire hiding behind. The first client who walked through my door was a woman not much older than me, holding a folder of paperwork with a shaking grip. I recognized instantly because it was the exact way I'd held my own portfolio walking into that ballroom. She apologized twice for wasting my time before she'd even sat down. I told her she wasn't wasting anything, and I meant it, more than she could have known. Torin restructured his company around transparent partnerships with local Houston organizations, insisting on outside audits every quarter. The kind of transparency that would have made all of this impossible if it had existed 5 years earlier. 6 months after that, the first phase of the Third Ward housing project was completed, funded in part by recovered assets. No Crow name on the building. No Row name either. The residents named it themselves. Hope Court. Riel 8 now painted a mural with the other kids in the development. A family. A home. Neighbors gathered together. No grandparents in the picture. I stood at the edge of that half-finished courtyard on a Saturday morning, the smell of fresh paint and cut grass in the air, watching my daughter kneel in the dirt in her overalls, carefully outlining a bright yellow sun in the corner of the wall, while another little girl argued with her over whose dog should go where in the mural. Riel didn't look back at me for reassurance the way she used to. She just worked, steady and unbothered, the way a child works when nothing heavy is sitting on her yet. I let myself stand there longer than I needed to, just watching that. That night, after Brielle had gone to sleep, Torin finally set the folder from his investigator down in front of me on the kitchen table. He didn't say anything at first, just slid it across the wood surface, the overhead light catching the edge of the manila cover, and waited while I opened it. "There's the accounts," he said, "but that's not what I really found." Inside was a copy of an old will my father's drawn up years before I ever sold that duplex. In it, Brielle was excluded entirely from any inheritance unless Solène returns under the authority of the family. I read the clause twice, the same way I'd read those forged authorization documents 4 months earlier, hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less ugly the second time. They didn't. Torin looked at me. "They never intended to give your daughter a place in this family. Not from the very beginning." I sat very still in the warm lamplight of our living room for a long time, the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, the house quiet, except for the refrigerator humming somewhere behind us. Then I asked him the question I'd been carrying since that envelope arrived at my office 5 years ago. "Was it you? The notes? The one about the duplex money? And the one 2 hours before the gala?" He shook his head gently. "No. I wish I'd known enough back then to warn you." 2 days later, I got my answer anyway. Not from Torin, but from Callista, in a phone call from her attorney's office before her plea hearing. She asked to speak to me alone. The line had that particular hollow sound of a speakerphone in a small office, someone's chair creaking somewhere in the background, a door closing down the hall. I could hear her breathing before she said anything, the kind of breath you take before you step off something high. "It was me," she said, quiet in a way I'd never heard from her. "All of it. The envelope in 2019, the text before the gala, the one about the hard drive." I closed my eyes. Somewhere in the back of my mind, small things rearranged themselves into a shape I should have seen years earlier. The pastry box she'd brought over 2 weeks before the gala, sitting a little too casually on my couch. The way she'd always known exactly how much to say and no more, dropping a thread and walking out my front door before I could pull on it. I understood sitting there, with the phone against my ear, that my sister had spent 5 years standing close enough to the fire to feel its heat, and never once close enough to be burned by it. What Callista wanted more than anything was to matter to our parents without having to become the person who finally stood up to them. So for years, she chose the smallest, safest form of loyalty she could manage, warning me in silence instead of speaking up out loud. That's the quiet tragedy underneath every anonymous note. She wasn't protecting our father by staying silent all those years. She was protecting herself from a confrontation she never felt strong enough to survive. Until the night she finally understood that silence had a cost too. She'd known for years. She said known, and stayed silent, and tried in small, anonymous pieces to give me just enough to protect myself, without ever having to be the one who broke the family apart. "I didn't have your courage," she told me, "so I left you breadcrumbs instead, and hoped you'd find your own way to the door." I didn't tell her it was enough. I didn't tell her it wasn't. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I heard her attorney's muffled voice in the background, telling her they needed to go. "I told you I was glad you finally said it out loud," I said instead. "And I meant it." She let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 5 years, and we said goodbye without either of us pretending we knew what came next for the two of us as sisters. The next morning, I signed the paperwork to formally protect Brielle's guardianship, cutting off every possible avenue of visitation or inheritance from the Crow side entirely. I sat at my kitchen table afterward for a long moment, with the pen still in my hand, feeling the strange lightness of a decision that had taken 5 years and 1 phone call and 34 years of silence to finally make. Brielle never asked about her grandfather again, and as for me, for the first time in longer than I can remember, I locked my front door and didn't leave a key out for anyone who still carried the name Crow. This story reminds us that loyalty and love are not the same thing, and blood is not a substitute for either one. If you've spent years managing a family member's feelings instead of your own peace, here's something you can actually do this week. Pull out whatever paperwork has your name quietly attached to someone else's decisions: a joint account, an old power of attorney, a will you haven't looked at since your husband passed. And sit down with someone you trust, not someone who benefits from your silence, and read it, line by line. Call the one friend who tells you the truth instead of what you want to hear, and tell her what you found. If a grandchild or a neighbor's kid needs you more than a difficult relative does, spend Sunday afternoon with them instead, without guilt attached. Peace doesn't arrive because you waited long enough for it. It arrives the week you finally ask a straight question and refuse to accept a vague answer. You've earned the right, at this stage of your life, to keep only the people at your table who've actually shown up for you. and to let that be reason enough.